Hi, cool coders. Today I'm going to be talking about serialization inside of Python. Now, this might be a new term for some of you, but we're going to walk through what this means and how you can use it to save data from things like objects. We've already looked at how to use strings with text files. We're going to take that a step further, and we're going to bring together several concepts that we've talked about already in today's lesson. So it'll be more of a synthesis of stuff that we've already learned and bringing it all together to make something that's more comprehensive inside of our code. So let's dive right in and get our heads around what serialization is, and then we'll go to some code samples that will bring together a lot of those ideas, as I mentioned, that we're going to be working with today. So by serialization, what I'm basically talking about is the ability to take object data and then put that into some kind of format that can be transmitted or stored. So we're basically talking about saving data from objects when we're talking about serialization. So I'm going to take an object that is produced by a class of some kind, and then I'm going to take the data of a particular object, and then I'm going to create some kind of data that can be stored, that is written to a disk that we've seen already, such as a text file, or it can be transmitted over the internet, that is being able to send it by way of an HTTP post to some kind of web server, from some kind of web server to some kind of browser or some other program that's receiving that on the other end of the wire. So this process is widely used in computing. You probably use it every day, you don't even realize it, but behind the scenes in a lot of the applications that we use on the internet, such as Gmail or some other website like Facebook, it's serializing data and on a server and then transmitting that over the internet, and then there's something on the other end, that's your browser typically, or an app on your phone that's receiving that data and converting it back into the objects that it was when it was sitting on the server. And that process of taking that data from the original state and putting it into something that can be transmitted is called serialization. And then deserialization is the converse of that, where something receives that data, typically a client, or in some cases the client takes data and sends it back to a server, and then that server takes that data and then deserializes that data back into objects. And that's what we call serialization and deserialization. So there's a lot of different formats that we can use for this. We're primarily going to be talking about one today that's called JSON, but there are a series of other ones out there. Some are YAML, some are called XML, some are binary, but we're going to be primarily talking about JSON because it's very easy to read and understand, but it's also very widely used on the internet as well. So let's go right to some code samples and see how this works. So here I've got some sample code, and some of this is going to look familiar and some of it's going to be new to you. We've already seen imports, and we know that's used to extend the base functionality of our basic functionality that's available in Python. So I'm importing something called JSON right here, which gives me the ability to work with JSON data. And we'll see how JSON shapes out in a minute. I'm not going to get into the details of JSON because we're really talking about serialization here. And again, there's a lot of other formats we can use. I'm just using JSON for the purpose of understanding our serialization format here. And we've seen this class already. We've used it in other examples when we talked about classes and inheritance. This is my person class. And remember, it's got a constructor. It's also got a method on it for greet, and it's accepting 2 parameters, name and job. And it's simply assigning those to these properties that are a part of whatever instance of this class, which would be an object. So in this case, I have my Blaze object down here that is instantiated from my person class, and it's taking Blaze as the 2 parameters. So that's the name and the job. And this is where the new stuff that we're going to be talking about today starts. So this is going to take the person class and create an object from it as Blaze, but then I'm going to call JSON right here. And so JSON is actually going to be doing something, and JSON has a method on it called dumps. And typically when we talk about taking data from one format and putting it into another, or from objects and putting it into a serialized form, we call that dumping the data. And sometimes we talk about doing a database dump or something like that. Anytime we talk about dumping inside of computing, basically it means that we're taking some kind of data that is in some kind of storage system. It could be in memory, it could be in a database, and we're converting that into some kind of serialized form. And we're doing a JSON dump here of an object. In this case, the object is Blaze. Now, dumps itself, though, can't read my object. So what I have to do is use a particular special property on my class, or on my object here, called dict__. And what this does is basically it takes all the properties on my object, and then it takes those properties and returns them as a dictionary. Remember, we talked about dictionaries earlier where we have key value pairs. Well, it's basically stripping out all of the methods off my object and just returning the properties as key value pairs. So that allows me to access them simply like an object, or like we saw with the dictionary whenever we were working with those. So that concept is going to be revisited here when we talk about working with objects with serialization. And dumps understands dictionaries, so basically I'm just taking the dictionary part of my class, so it's basically just going to contain name and job, and then returning that to our dumps method here, and it's going to then take that and convert that to a string, which is then my data that is serialized. And then right here, I'm just simply printing that string out. So let's go over to Tony and take a look at this code, and let's walk through it and see exactly what's going on in that code. And we will be able to see the actual string that gets put out, and we'll see the JSON formatted data. So right here inside of Tony, I have my program that we just saw on the slide up, and this is doing an import, and this is where it's initializing the class. But line 11 is where things start to get more interesting. So I'm going to run the script here. I'm going to debug it. Notice what it's doing is it's creating a new object called Blaze, and I'm going to step over this right here. And this is creating a new object called Blaze right here that you can see up here in my variables. And right here, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a JSON.dumps right here using the Blaze object, and again calling the dictionary portion of that. Let's step over that. Now, let's take a look at X over here inside of our variables, and notice that it's got the parameters on the dictionary that it represents whenever it serialized that. So if I just print that, that's going to print exactly what we saw inside of our variables down there back to the console. So this is really just doing some very basic stuff here. It's doing a instantiation of a class as an object. It's calling this JSON.dumps to produce this string right here, and then it's simply printing that string out. Now, because this is a string, I can actually do something with it. I could actually write that to a file, or if I was running a web server, I could send this over the internet. So this is a very useful way to get data in a form that is very useful for writing to a file. So keep that in the back of your mind. I'm going to be asking you to actually do this whenever we go to the challenge. The real interesting part of this comes when we start talking about deserialization. So deserialization is the process of reversing this process. So let's go back to the slide deck and then take a look at some code samples where we actually do some deserialization. So I'm back here on the slide deck, and I have here some additional code that we've added to the existing code that we've already reviewed. We've already looked at this code right here, which is our import JSON, where we create a class, we do some serialization and so on, and we print the serialized data in variable X back right here. And we've already seen how that works. These next 3 lines of code are doing some other interesting things. So basically what we want to do is take the process that we had and reverse it. So serializing gets it into the string, which I can then use for transmitting something over the internet or writing to a file, etc. I want to reverse that process. So I want to be able to take that string data and take it back into an object. So let's do that. So right here, I have a new object called Blaze Clone Dict. And this is a dictionary object that I want to create, because I'm going to take the dumps and reverse that process using JSON.loads. So JSON.loads takes string data and simply reads the string data and writes that back to a dictionary. Now this is important because a dictionary, while it's a kind of object of sort, isn't my original object. In fact, it's just a dictionary. So what this requires that I do is take the properties that are on that dictionary and pass them back into a constructor for my class so that I can get that data out of that dictionary. And that's what this next line does. So I'm only halfway there at this point. So if I do this next line right here, where I have this blaze clone right here, this is the actual object that is a person object. And so what this is doing is it's taking the properties of the dictionary and passing them as parameters. And that's where this star notation comes from right here. And that's basically saying, Python, take the properties on this dictionary and map them to the parameters of my constructor. And you can see that those are name and job. So basically it's taking the properties on the dictionary, that is the key value pairs that we might have inside of our dictionary, and then mapping those onto these parameters up here, name and job. So it's just basically taking those parameters off of this object and passing them into the person constructor up here where they match. And so this allows me to basically save data as it exists inside of my class, self.name right here, and self.job. But in this case, because I have the parameters named the same as the properties, then it is able to map those back to the properties respectively inside of my class. And so what that does is it passes the parameters as dictionaries. So this is one reason why people will typically use the parameter names of the objects they're creating as the same as the properties inside their class, so that they can easily do this deserialization process with this line of code right here. And then once I have that completed, I can then do a method call from my my new object here, my Blaze clone object. I can then this would actually crash right here, so that's actually not going to work. I would have to say Blaze clone greet. Now, if I was to create Okay, here I am looking at my same code that I had already. We've already gone over this part right here, which is our code that creates our class and gets our object into a serialized form as a string. And down here is where stuff starts to get interesting again. So right here, what I'm doing is I'm creating a new object from JSON. So what this method does, JSON.loads, it does the converse of what we saw up here with JSON.dumps. So what this does is it takes the data, that string data, and attempts to load it from a JSON format. So in this case, it's taking the dump from a dictionary as a dictionary into a string format, which we've seen already, and it's reversing that process. So deserialization is all about reversing the process of serialization. So this is taking the data from the particular example that we saw already, and then reversing that and sending it back into a dictionary. So remember up here, we did a dictionary first from our object in order to serialize it. So this is going to basically reverse the steps that we saw already. So it's going to take the string data and put it back into a dictionary object right here. And then it's going to take that object, and then it's going to attempt to deserialize that back into our data that we had on our original object. So I have right here a new object called Blaze Clone, and it is an instance of the person class that we originally created our serialized data from. Now, what we're doing here inside of the constructor, though, is something that we haven't looked at already. So I have parameters, but I only have a single parameter on this new person object that I'm creating. So what I'm doing right here is I'm doing star star, and what this tells my program to do is look at the properties on my dictionary right here and use those to match the parameters up here inside of my class that I have up here. So I have name and job, and remember, those are the actual parameters that were on the properties that were on my serialized data when we looked at that. So it's basically saying, look at the properties on this dictionary and use those as the parameters on my constructor. So it's basically matching the names of the parameters against the keys in this dictionary. So that's important to remember, because this allows me to have the ability to serialize and deserialize things rather easily. And it's also one reason that people will use the parameter names on the constructor to be the same as the parameter names on the actual properties that they're serializing into as well. So this allows me to match those very easily with this dictionary object. And so it basically just calls that constructor, but instead of actually explicitly passing those in, it's just calling them and inferring the names from the keys inside of that dictionary that we deserialized up here. And once I have that, I have a new object, Blaze Clone, and I can simply call the greet method on this. And so I'm going to call blaze.greet, and it's going to return this string right here that we have up here in my greet method. So let's go back over to Tony and take a look at this code in action, and it will be a very concise example, but it's going to take what we did already and reverse it. So let's take the code that we saw on our previous slide, and let's go ahead and add it here. I just basically pasted the code in from the slide, and this is going to run everything that we had already, and it's going to print the serialized data, and then it's going to take that same data, load it up into a dictionary as we saw, take that dictionary and pass it into a new instance of my person class, and then it's going to call greet right here. So let's run this and see what happens. I'm going to set a breakpoint right here. I already have a breakpoint, and let's just debug the script. And let's call the debug, and let's walk through this. So we've seen this already, and there we're getting our output, and of course we see it up there. And let's reverse the process now, and let's create our new dictionary from that particular data. So that's getting a new Blaze Clone dictionary, and that is going to have my dictionary right here. And as you can see up there, my variables, we can see name, Blaze, job, programmer. And now it's going to take those properties and then pass them into the constructor. So let's set a breakpoint right here and step into this. And let's go into the constructor for my method here, and let's see what happens. And notice what I have here as my name property and my job property. So notice what it has. It inferred those parameters from the dictionary. So it mapped the parameters from the dictionary. So this is my dictionary right here where the name, it mapped that onto this name, and it said job onto this job. And now it's going to assign those variables or those parameters to the properties on my object here. So let's do a step over that, and let's come back out of this, and then let's just call greet. and we can step into this, and we can see what happens when I call this, and it's going to crash. The reason why it crashed is, notice what I have here. I have the name of my dictionary, and I did that on purpose because I wanted you to see it crash, because that means that I'm trying to pass the actual original dictionary into the object, not the actual object that I was actually working on. And so it crashed the program because a dictionary type doesn't have a greet method on it. So what I need to do is simply replace it with my object, and we can just set a breakpoint right here. Since we've already seen this run, we can see it spit out the now fixed code with blaze.greet right there. And so that is actually what it's doing whenever I get to this line right here. So I got a breakpoint right there. Let's run this to completion and resume, and it gets down to blaze.greet, and we will see it output that my name is Blaze, I am a programmer. So we go full cycle whenever we serialize and deserialize data. So this is an important concept in programming. So let's take this idea and let's take it a step further that I want you to do in a challenge. So let's go look at what I want you to do there. Congratulations to this week's challenge submissions. We have Madison B, Samuel G, Jacob G, and Judson S. And thank you guys for your submissions. So for the challenge this week, it's pretty linear, so here's the requirements that I want you to kind of consider for this week's challenge. So first I want you to create a class, which we've already done, so you can either use the code samples that I'll put up in the repository for the Cool Enough to Code repositories for this particular example, or you can create your own. Then I want you to create an object from your class. Of course, you already know how to do that since we've been working with classes already. And then I want you to serialize the object, similar to what we saw in the code. Now here's where we deviate from what we saw in the code samples. I want you to take the serialized data and write it to a file. And then when you have that file written, I want you to then read that same file and get the serialized data from that file. And then I want you to deserialize that data back into an object, and then call a method on your object with that deserialized data. So this is basically extending what we did in the code samples that we just saw. We were just writing it to a string and then deserializing the string. I want you to actually write it to a file and read it from a file. And this will show you how you can use serialization to save objects. It's a nice way to write something to a disk and read something from a disk as well. So try and work on that, figure out how to make that work, and then take that and submit it to me. So it shouldn't be too much more than what we've already seen already. You can work from my example, like I said, or you can just come up with your own if you so desire. And then you can find the code samples here on this URL, github.com/theonemule/ce2c. So looking forward to your submissions on this week's challenge. This will be a little bit more challenging than some that we've seen, but maybe for some of you it won't be. But it'll be fun to think about how you can use this in some other programming that you might do in the future. So stay tuned for that. If you like this content, please consider liking this video, then clicking on the subscribe button to subscribe to our channel, then clicking on the bell notification icon and selecting all so that you'll get notifications when new content becomes available on our channel. You can also click on the share icon and share this video to any of your social media platforms. Sharing this helps make it more widely available for those who might be interested in coding. Also, consider following us on Twitter so you can see updates on Twitter whenever new content becomes available, as well as other announcements related to Cool Enough to Code. You can also help us out by becoming a patron on our page by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/coolenoughToCode and then clicking on Become a Patron, and there you can find out more information about how you can support our work with Cool Enough to Code. And like always, you can check us out online at coolenoughToCode.com. There you can find a schedule of all of the upcoming lessons that we have. You can also find out more information and reach out to us online here. And you can also watch the live stream as it comes out each week on coolenoughToCode.com as well. And like always, thanks for watching this lesson on Cool Enough to Code.